Let me tell you something today. There will come a time in a man's life when the crowd will vanish, the applause will fade, the phone won't ring, and the people you thought were for you will be nowhere to be found. There comes a moment in every man's life when the noise dies down, the crowds disperse, and the applause goes silent. It's in that place of solitude, that uncomfortable silence, where a man starts to feel the weight of isolation. But what many don't realize is that isolation, when seen through the lens of God's purpose, is not rejection. It's preparation. When God pulls people out of your life, when He allows the phone calls to stop and the support system to crumble, He's not abandoning you. He's setting the stage for something bigger. He's stripping away the distractions so that He can work on the core of who you are. Your character, your faith, your dependence on Him. You see, we often associate progress with visibility. We think if we're not being seen, promoted, or celebrated, then we're not growing. But God does His best work in hidden places. A seed doesn't grow in the light. It breaks open and begins its transformation deep in the dark soil, unseen and unknown. And just like that seed, God sometimes buries you, not to forget you, but to develop you in private before He elevates you in public. Think about Moses. He spent 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep, far from the palace of Egypt, far from his calling. But those silent years weren't wasted. God was preparing him for a leadership role that would shake nations. Moses didn't walk into Pharaoh's court with nothing. He walked in with years of wilderness wisdom forged in isolation. That time alone with God taught him humility, patience, and trust. Without the desert, Moses wouldn't have had the strength to lead the Israelites out of bondage. David, too, had to walk through isolation. Before he wore the crown, he was a shepherd boy alone in the fields, watching sheep, writing psalms, fighting off lions and bears with no one cheering him on. No social media followers, no spotlight, no royal treatment, just him and God. But it was in those moments that David learned to worship. It was there that he developed the heart of a king. His time in the shadows taught him how to be strong when no one else was watching, how to stay faithful when it didn't seem to matter. God uses isolation to prepare a man because in the quiet, your ears become more sensitive to His voice. When the noise of the world is turned down, you can finally hear the whisper of heaven. You stop relying on the opinions of others and start depending on the direction of the Spirit. God becomes your counselor, your coach, your comforter. And the man who emerges from that process is not the same man who went in. Isolation forces you to confront yourself. Without the distractions of people's praise or criticism, you come face to face with your weaknesses, your fears, and your faith. You discover whether your foundation is built on popularity or on the promises of God. And that's where the transformation begins. God is not interested in building men who are only strong when they're surrounded by fans. He's building warriors who can stand alone and still declare, God is my strength. Sometimes we pray for promotion and God sends isolation instead. We ask for blessing and he gives us silence. It's not because he's denying your request. It's because he's preparing your capacity to handle what you asked for. If you can't survive the quiet, you're not ready for the crowd. If you can't be faithful in the wilderness, you're not prepared for the promise. So when you find yourself alone, don't panic. Don't rush to fill the silence with people, noise, or activity. Lean in, listen, grow. Because in that lonely place, God is doing something sacred. He's not punishing you. He's positioning you. He's not discarding you. He's developing you. He's using isolation not to hurt you, but to make you ready for what he's about to do in and through you. The silence may feel heavy. The loneliness may seem unbearable, but it's not the end of your story. It's the beginning of your becoming. In the stillness, God is crafting the kind of man who can carry his glory, stand firm in the storm, and lead with courage. That kind of man isn't built in the spotlight. He's built in the shadows. And that process always begins in isolation. There will be times in life when everything that once felt certain begins to unravel. The people you thought would always be there suddenly disappear. Friends stop calling. Family doesn't understand. Your support system collapses like a house of cards, and you're left standing in the wreckage, wondering what went wrong. It's a place of raw vulnerability, where the only voice left to hear is your own. And if you listen carefully, the voice of God. And in that moment, when all human support has dried up and you feel completely alone, you begin to discover a powerful truth. God's presence is not just a comfort. It's more than enough. When everything else fades, when all the familiar faces turn their backs or simply vanish, God does not move. He does not flinch, does not hesitate, does not forget. He stays. He is the constant in the chaos, the anchor in the storm, the stillness in your soul when your world is spinning out of control. What feels like abandonment by others is often God's invitation to intimacy. He draws near when everyone else walks away because he wants you to see that his presence is not just an accessory to your life. It is the very essence of it. We live in a world that measures value by company. If you're surrounded by many, you must be important. If people celebrate you, then you must be doing something right. But God flips that script. He often removes the crowd to show you that you don't need them to be sustained, elevated, or fulfilled. You don't need their applause when you have His approval. You don't need their affirmation when you've been adopted by the King of Kings. The presence of God is not secondary. It is central. And when you realize that, you begin to live from a place of strength that doesn't depend on the changing opinions of others. Take a look at the story of Elijah. After his bold confrontation with the prophets of Baal, he found himself running for his life, alone, exhausted, and afraid. He even asked God to let him die. But God met him, not in the fire, not in the earthquake, not in the wind, but in a still small voice. That whisper wasn't just a moment of peace. It was a declaration of presence. God was saying, I'm still here. I never left. And that presence gave Elijah the strength to rise again. Or look at Paul writing from prison, cut off from the churches he planted, abandoned by companions, yet declaring with boldness, but the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength. When everyone else was gone, Paul didn't break. He stood. Not because of his own willpower, but because he was sustained by the presence of the living God. That presence empowered him to preach in chains, to worship in prison, to keep going when every reason said to give up. God's presence is not just a theological idea. It is a practical reality for those who will lean into it. It walks with you in hospital rooms, sits with you in lonely apartments, surrounds you in courtrooms, and comforts you in funeral homes. His presence doesn't always change your situation, but it changes you in the situation. It fills you with peace when you should be panicking. It strengthens your heart when it should be breaking. It lifts your head when everything says to bow it in defeat. That's why some of the strongest moments in a believer's life come not when everything is going right, but when everything is going wrong, and yet they still have joy, still have hope, still have faith. That's the evidence of a man or woman who has discovered that God's presence is enough. They've walked through the fire and found God in the flame. They've sat in silence and heard the voice that breaks through darkness. They've stood alone and realized they were never truly alone. You don't know the sufficiency of God's presence until it's all you have. And once you've tasted it, you'll never again fear being forsaken by men. Because you'll know that even if everyone else walks out, your God walks in. Even if you're abandoned by the world, you're still held by heaven. There is a strength that comes from walking with God that no human relationship can substitute. Friends may comfort, family may support, but only God can sustain. Only God can give peace that surpasses understanding. Only God can stand with you in the lion's den, in the furnace, in the storm, and bring you out without a scratch on your soul. So when life strips everything away and you find yourself alone with God, don't despair. That's not the end of your story. That's the beginning of your transformation. Because when you have no one but God, and you realize He is more than enough, you will walk in a power, a peace, and a purpose that nothing and no one can take away. There's something powerful about a man who's been through private trials. When you see someone standing tall in public, walking in purpose and authority, what you don't see is the process that took place in the dark. You don't see the lonely nights, the unanswered prayers, the battles fought behind closed doors. Public triumphs are always preceded by private trials. God never elevates a man until He first refines him. Before there's a platform, there's a process. Before there's recognition, there's resistance. And before there's a crown, there's a cross. God is not interested in giving influence to someone who hasn't been tested in the shadows. He knows that the weight of public success can crush a man who hasn't developed the strength to carry it. That's why He takes time to build you when no one is watching. He allows you to be overlooked, rejected, and even broken, not because He's forgotten you, but because He's forming you. You see, we often ask God for elevation, but God answers with preparation. He won't give you something great until you're strong enough to handle it. Take Joseph, for example. He had a dream as a teenager, a vision of greatness, of authority, of influence. But before the dream came to pass, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and locked in prison. His character was shaped in the shadows long before he stood before Pharaoh. Joseph didn't walk into the palace by accident. He walked in refined, humbled, and ready. If God had promoted him right after the dream, he wouldn't have had the wisdom or maturity to handle it. But after years of being tried in private, he was ready for public triumph. Private trials test your faith when no one's looking. They ask questions like, will you still believe when the promise looks dead? Will you still worship when the door slams shut? Will you still obey when obedience costs you everything? It's easy to be faithful when people are watching. But what about when no one is? That's where integrity is born. That's where true strength is developed. In the quiet, in the mundane, in the painful moments when it feels like your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling, God is watching. And He's working. David was anointed to be king as a teenager, but he didn't sit on the throne right away. He went back to tending sheep. He killed lions and bears in the field, not in the spotlight. Then he fought Goliath, not as a warrior with a sword, but as a shepherd with a sling. He learned how to trust God in the pasture before he trusted Him in battle. And even after slaying the giant, David spent years on the run from Saul, hiding in caves, often alone, misunderstood, and betrayed. Those were his private trials. That's where he learned to cry out to God, to lean not on his own strength, but on divine provision. That's where the Psalms came from. Not from palaces, but from pressure. There's a reason why God doesn't deliver you instantly. There's something he's producing in you that you can't learn in comfort. Trials have a way of bringing to the surface what's truly inside you. They reveal your weaknesses and force you to lean on God's strength. They strip away pride, self-sufficiency, and fear, and they replace them with faith, patience, and resilience. And when the time comes for God to elevate you, you won't just arrive. You'll be ready. Public victories don't mean anything if you haven't first been victorious in private. Winning battles in silence builds the confidence to stand in the spotlight without being destroyed by it. It teaches you to rely on God instead of applause, to seek his approval over public opinion. And when the breakthrough finally comes, when God opens the door, you won't be surprised. You'll be prepared. That's why you should never despise your hidden season. It may feel like no one sees you, like your effort is going unnoticed, but God sees. He sees the late nights you spend praying. He sees the tears you cry in secret. He sees the sacrifices you make when no one else understands. And he's storing it all up. Because when the day of triumph comes, it won't just be a reward. It will be a reflection of everything he's done in you when no one else was around. So if you're walking through private trials right now, don't give up. Don't rush the process. What you're facing in the dark is preparing you to shine in the light. God doesn't waste pain. He doesn't ignore preparation. And he never forgets his promise. The man who endures the private trials with faith and obedience is the man God trusts with public triumphs. When everything you've been leaning on begins to collapse, when the resources run dry, the connections fade, and the opportunities vanish, it can feel like you're being abandoned. But what if that collapse isn't the end of something, but the beginning of something greater? What if God is removing the things you've depended on, not to leave you helpless, but to show you that he alone is your true source? So many people confuse resources with the source. A job is a resource. A friend is a resource. Your savings account, your skills, your network. Those are all resources, but none of those things are the source. God is the source, and he will often allow the resources to dry up so you can finally recognize who's been providing for you all along. When you lose the job, the check doesn't come, or the people walk away. You begin to understand that those things were never the foundation. They were just tools in God's hands. Take the story of Elijah during the drought. God had sent him to the brook Cherith, where he drank water and was fed by ravens. But then the brook dried up. It wasn't because Elijah had done something wrong. It wasn't because God was punishing him. It was because God was ready to move him to the next phase. The drying of the brook wasn't a sign of God's absence. It was a signal of divine transition. God was saying, you've stayed here long enough. I've got another place of provision prepared for you. And sure enough, he sent Elijah to Zarephath, where a widow was waiting, another resource provided by the source. That's how God works. He shifts resources, not to punish you, but to stretch your faith and deepen your trust. He wants you to stop worshiping the method and start worshiping the provider. Because as long as your hope is tied to the resource, your faith is fragile. But when your trust is anchored in the source, nothing can shake you. When God is your source, you don't panic when the company downsizes. You don't fall apart when a door closes. You don't lose your identity when people walk away. Because your foundation isn't built on what you have. It's built on who he is. He's Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. And his provision doesn't depend on your situation. He can bring water from a rock, manna from heaven, and favor from the most unlikely places. Sometimes we hold so tightly to the things we can see, not realizing that God has something greater we cannot yet perceive. So he has to remove the visible to make room for the invisible. He has to take away what's familiar so you can discover what's eternal. And in that moment, when the crutches are gone and the comforts are removed, you're faced with the question, do you trust him? Do you really believe he's enough? It's easy to say God is your provider when the bank account is full. It's another thing entirely when the numbers don't make sense and the bills are still due. That's when faith is tested. That's when you find out if God is just a concept or if he's your reality. And it's in those moments, those stripped down, nothing left, God, I don't know how, moments that you experience the richness of his presence like never before. Abraham walked up Mount Moriah with a knife in his hand and his son by his side, believing God would provide a sacrifice. He didn't have a backup plan. He didn't have a guarantee. All he had was faith in the source. And just when it seemed like he had nothing left, God stepped in and said, stop. There's a ram in the bush. The resource was waiting. The source had already provided. That's the kind of trust God wants to build in you. The kind that walks without seeing, obeys without understanding, and believes without proof. Because when you finally recognize that God is the one sustaining you, guiding you, and opening doors for you, you stop chasing people and start chasing his presence. You stop depending on outcomes and start depending on his word. And the beauty of it all is that once you've been through a season where God showed up when nothing else could, you'll never fear lack again. You'll know deep in your bones that even if the brook dries up, even if the ravens stop coming, even if the connections fall away, your God will still make a way. Because he was never limited to the resource. He is the source, and he will never run dry. When a man has no one but God, one of the most transformative things he discovers is the power of prayer. Not the routine, surface-level prayer that we often mutter before meals or at the end of a day, but real, desperate, gut-level communication with the creator of the universe. When everyone else is gone and the noise of life fades, what remains is the purest, rawest form of relationship between man and God. In that space, prayer becomes more than a discipline. It becomes a lifeline. Prayer has a way of shifting. When your circumstances change, when you're surrounded by people, supported by resources, and affirmed by success, prayer can easily become a formality. But when those things are stripped away, when the phone stops ringing and the room is quiet, prayer becomes the only connection you have left. And that's when it becomes real. That's when it becomes powerful. Because you're not praying out of habit. You're praying out of hunger. You're not seeking answers. You're seeking him. In those moments of solitude, when the weight is too heavy and the tears won't stop, prayer becomes your place of refuge. It becomes the one space where you can be fully seen, fully known, and still fully loved. You can come to God without pretense, without performance, without fear of rejection. He already knows the burden you carry, but he invites you to lay it down at his feet. Not because he needs the information, but because you need the transformation. The Psalms are filled with the cries of a man who had nothing left but God. David didn't just pray when he was victorious. He prayed when he was in valleys, when he was pursued by enemies, when he was broken by his own sin. And through it all, he was honest. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? Why are you so far from saving me? Free it in me a clean heart. Oh God, these weren't polished, perfect prayers. They were the prayers of a man who knew that only God could carry the weight he was under. And that's the invitation for every man who finds himself in a place of isolation. Don't waste the silence. Don't numb the pain. Don't distract yourself from the discomfort. Press into it. Let it drive you to your knees, because it's in that posture of surrender that God does his greatest work. He's not looking for eloquence. He's looking for authenticity. He's not moved by vocabulary. He's moved by vulnerability. You see, when prayer becomes your first instinct rather than your last resort, everything changes. Your situation might not change immediately, but you begin to change. Prayer aligns your heart with God's heart. It doesn't just tell God about your circumstances. It invites Him into them. And when God steps into your circumstance, the weight doesn't break you, it builds you. The valley doesn't defeat you, it develops you. Sometimes God allows the crowd to leave so that your ears can finally hear Him clearly. So much of life is filled with noise, opinions, advice, criticism, distractions. But when the noise is silenced, you begin to hear the still, small voice of God speaking directly to your soul. I am with you. Do not fear. You are mine. That voice doesn't shout, but it pierces. It doesn't demand, but it draws. And when you've heard it, really heard it, nothing else compares. This is what Jesus modeled throughout His time on earth. Even though He was surrounded by crowds, constantly needed, constantly pulled at, He withdrew regularly to be alone with the Father. He understood the importance of solitude and communion. And if the Son of God needed to get alone with God, how much more do we? A man who has no one but God learns that prayer is not a backup plan. It's the plan. It's the source of strength when everything else fails. It's the source of peace when the storm rages. It's the place where decisions are made, battles are won, and courage is restored. You may not always see the results right away, but something always happens when you pray. Heaven listens, angels move, hearts shift. You are never the same after an encounter with the living God. And once you've learned to depend on prayer, you become dangerous to the enemy, because the man who knows how to get a hold of God is the man who can't be manipulated by fear. He doesn't need applause to feel validated. He doesn't need people to feel secure. His foundation is firm, not because life is easy, but because his connection with God is unshakable. That's the power of a man who has been stripped of everything, but still has a prayer in his mouth and faith in his heart. He's not praying out of obligation. He's praying because he knows it's the only way through. And in that space, in that sacred communion, he is transformed. Not because his world changes instantly, but because God meets him in the middle of it. And once you've had that kind of encounter, you never walk the same again. When a man has no one but God, he discovers the strength and clarity that only comes from walking in divine identity. You see, when people are around, it's easy to define yourself by their opinions. It's easy to attach your worth to your relationships, your status, your income, or your accomplishments. But when those things are taken away, when you're left alone with God, you're forced to confront a deeper truth. Who are you without the titles, without the applause, without the image you've built? And more importantly, who does God say you are? There is something refining about isolation. when the noise of the world quiets down, when there are no hands clapping and no voices cheering, the only voice left is the one that matters most, God's voice. And he doesn't define you by your past, by your pain, or even by your performance. He defines you by your position in him. You are a son. You are chosen. You are loved. And sometimes God has to let everything else fall away so that those truths can finally sink in. Many men go through life wearing masks, pretending to be strong when they're really broken, pretending to be confident while hiding fear, pretending to have it all together while silently falling apart. But when God removes the stage, when he removes the audience, that's when the mask comes off. And while that might feel uncomfortable, it's necessary. Because God cannot bless who you pretend to be. He can only bless who you truly are. In the quiet place, God doesn't shame you. He shapes you. He doesn't expose you to destroy you. He exposes you to heal you. That's why the wilderness is so vital. In Scripture, we see time and time again how God calls men into isolation before he launches them into their assignment. Moses spent 40 years in the desert before he led Israel out of Egypt. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness before stepping into public ministry. Paul spent years in obscurity after his conversion before writing the letters that would shape the church. Why? Because God was stripping away the old identity so they could walk confidently in the new one. When a man has no one but God, his ears are finally tuned to heaven. He starts hearing what God says about him rather than what the world has shouted. And when God speaks, he speaks with authority. He doesn't say, you might be. He says, you are. You are redeemed. You are equipped. You are called. You are not who your past says you are. You are not who your failures tried to label you. You are who he says you are. That identity isn't based on feelings. It's based on fact. It's not tied to your bank account, your career, or your relationship status. It's rooted in something eternal. And once you embrace that, your whole life changes. You stop seeking validation from others. You stop compromising who you are to be accepted. You stop shrinking to fit in places God never assigned you to. Instead, you rise. You stand. You walk with a different kind of confidence. Not arrogance, but assurance. Not pride, but purpose. Because when you know who you are in God, you stop chasing identity and start living from it. You realize you don't need to prove yourself. You just need to be yourself in him. And that's when you become unshakable. Because identity rooted in God isn't moved by circumstances. It's not shaken by rejection. It's not weakened by delay. It's grounded in truth. This kind of clarity only comes when the distractions are removed. That's why solitude isn't punishment. It's preparation. It's God pulling you aside so he can tell you who you really are. And when you come out of that season, you don't come out confused. You come out convicted. You don't come out insecure. You come out equipped. The enemy wants to distort your identity because he knows that if you ever walk in the fullness of who God made you to be, you'll be a threat to his kingdom. That's why the attacks come. That's why the isolation feels so intense. But the very fact that you're being pressed on every side is evidence that there's something powerful inside of you. God is not trying to break you. He's trying to birth something through you. So when you find yourself in that place where it's just you and God, don't run from it. Lean into it. Ask the hard questions. Let him peel back the layers. Let him show you the man you were always meant to be. Because once you know who you are in him, you'll never settle for anything less again. You'll walk differently, speak differently, live differently, because you'll no longer be defined by your surroundings. You'll be defined by your Savior. And that kind of identity can never be taken from you.